When Sheriff Wyatt's daughter aids a wounded Cheyenne warrior, love and truth ignite a clash with her father and a vengeful posse. Can courage bridge two divided worlds? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are. Watching from today? The sun beat down on Barrel Creek like it had a personal grudge against the town. Sheriff Harlan Wyatt stood on the porch of his office, squinting at the dusty main street. At 55, his face was as weathered as old leather, his blue eyes hard as river stones. The badge on his chest caught the sunlight and threw it back, a warning that gleamed for all to see. "Afternoon, Sheriff," called Elmer from the general store, tipping his hat. Harlan nodded back. He didn't waste words, never had. Words were like bullets. You used them only when necessary, and you made them count. Inside the sheriff's office, Deputy Tom Rawlins sat with his boots propped on the desk, hastily dropping them to the floor when Harlan entered. "Any trouble?" Harlan asked, hanging his hat on the rack. "Quiet as a church, sir," Tom said. "Except Mr. Donovan's complaining about trespassers near his north pasture again. Says he found tracks." Harlan grunted. "Probably just travelers cutting through. I'll ride out tomorrow." He checked his pocket watch. Almost time for supper. Ruth would have it waiting, just like her mother used to. The thought of his late wife, Sarah, still brought a tightness to his chest. Even 6 years after the fever took her, he'd raised their 2 children, Ruth and Jude, with the same firm hand he used to keep order in Barrel Creek. Rules were rules. Discipline was survival. "I'm heading home," he told Tom. "Lock up when you're done." The Wyatt house sat on the edge of town, a solid 2-story building with a wide porch and clean white paint. As Harlan approached, he could see Ruth through the kitchen window, moving back and forth as she prepared the evening meal. 24 years old and unmarried, something that bothered him more than he let on. Not that there weren't suitors. Several of the town's young men had shown interest, but Ruth kept them at arm's length. "Too busy taking care of you and Jude," she'd say when he brought it up. But Harlan knew better. There was something distant in his daughter, something that had grown since Sarah died. Like she was waiting for something that hadn't arrived yet. As he walked through the door, the smell of fresh bread and stew greeted him. "Evening, Father," Ruth said, not looking up from the pot she was stirring. Her dark hair was pulled back. In a simple bun, her dress plain but spotless. "Where's your brother?" Harlan asked, washing his hands at the sink. "Out back, fixing that broken fence post." Harlan nodded, pleased. Jude was 18 now, lanky and thoughtful, where Ruth was compact and determined. The boy took after his mother that way, quiet, watching, thinking more than he spoke. Dinner was the same as always, good food and little conversation. Harlan didn't believe in idle chatter at mealtimes. After, Ruth cleaned up while Jude helped, and Harlan sat in his chair by the fire, reading the latest newspaper from the big city. "There's talk of more trouble with the Indians up north," he said, folding the paper. "Army's been called in." Ruth's hands paused over the dishes. "What kind?" "Of trouble. The usual, raids, livestock stolen. Some say they're coming south. Or maybe they're just trying to survive," Ruth said quietly. Harlan's eyes narrowed. "They have their reservations. They belong there." "Yes, Father." Her voice was even, but something in it made Harlan watch her more closely. Later that night, with the house quiet and dark, Ruth sat by her bedroom window, staring out at the moonlit landscape. The river glinted silver in the distance, winding its way through the valley. She pressed her hand against the glass, feeling the cool night air seeping through. 2 weeks ago, everything had changed by that river. She'd gone to gather herbs that grew along the banks, taking her time, enjoying the rare solitude. That's when she heard it. A low groan, almost animal-like, coming from behind a cluster of rocks. What she found was a man, his leg caught in a rusty trap, the metal teeth dug deep into his flesh. He was Native American, dressed in a mixture of traditional clothing and cast-off white man's garments. His face was etched with pain, but his eyes, dark and clear, locked onto hers without fear. "If you kill me, make it fast," he said in perfect English, his voice steady despite his pain. "If you feed me, I won't forget." Ruth had never disobeyed her father in any significant way. She'd been raised to follow rules, to keep her head down, to be the proper daughter of Barrel Creek's sheriff. But in that moment, looking at the wounded man, Something shifted inside her. She knelt beside him. "I'm going to help you," she said, "but I need to get this trap off first." It took all her strength to pry the metal jaws apart. The man didn't cry out, though sweat beaded on his forehead. When the trap finally released, blood flowed freely from the wound. "My name is Ruth," she said, tearing strips from her petticoat. "To bind his leg, Chaska," he replied, watching her work with those steady eyes. "Why are you helping me?" Ruth paused, her hands bloody. "Because you're hurt, and because—" She couldn't finish the thought. Over the next 2 weeks, Ruth made excuses to leave the house, gathering herbs, doing laundry by the river, taking long walks. She brought Chaska food, clean water, and bandages. She moved him to a small cave in the Red Cliffs, where he would be safe from discovery. She learned he was Northern Cheyenne, 27 years old, educated at a mission school before returning to his people. He spoke of his tribe, his family, and the struggles they faced. He never complained about his pain or his circumstances, and Ruth found herself telling him things she'd never told anyone, about her mother's death, about the suffocating weight of her father's expectations, about her dreams of seeing the world beyond Barrel Creek. "How you have a strong spirit," Chaska told her one day as she changed his bandage. "Like a river that looks calm but runs deep." No one had ever spoken to her that way before. Now, sitting by her window, Ruth touched the small object hidden in her pocket, a pendant carved from bone in the shape of a feather. Chaska had given it to her yesterday for protection, he'd said. "And so you remember that some things can be both strong and light." A sudden knock at her bedroom door made her jump. "Ruth?" It was Jude, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you awake?" She opened the door to find her brother, his face troubled, in the dim light of the oil lamp he carried. "What's wrong?" she asked. "I overheard some men talking at Barton's store today," he said, slipping into her room and closing the door. "They're forming a posse. There's a bounty out for a Cheyenne man accused of killing Frank Donovan's brother and burning his homestead. They say he's hiding somewhere near the river." Ruth's blood went cold. "When?" "The killing happened about 3 weeks ago, near the Northern Valley. They're saying he's wounded and dangerous." Jude studied her face. "Ruth, what is it? You've gone white as a sheet." She sank onto her bed, mind racing. It couldn't be Chaska. He'd been badly hurt when she found him, yes, but from a trap, not a fight. And he wasn't the kind of man who would murder someone and set fire to their home. She knew that with a certainty that surprised even her. "Jude, I need to tell you something," she said slowly. "But you have to promise to keep it secret." Her brother sat beside her, his young face solemn. "You know I will." So Ruth told him everything, finding Chaska, helping him, their conversations, the growing connection between them. Jude listened without interrupting, his expression changing from shock to concern to understanding. "You care about him," he said when she finished. It wasn't a question. Ruth nodded. "He's not what Father and the others think. He's not a killer. But if they find him, they won't give him a chance to explain. They'll hang him." Ruth stood up, suddenly decisive. "I need to warn him tonight. He's strong enough to travel now. He can get away before they start searching." Jude grabbed her arm. "Ruth, if Father catches you—" "He won't," she said with more confidence than she felt. "I'll be back before dawn. He never checks our rooms at night." Her brother looked torn. Finally, he nodded. "Be careful. If something happens to you—" Ruth hugged him quickly. "Nothing will happen. I'll be fine." She changed into her darkest dress, pulled on a shawl and filled a basket with bread, dried meat, and a canteen of water. Jude helped her slip out through the kitchen door, promising to cover for her if needed. The night was cool, the moon providing just enough light to see the path. Ruth moved quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. The journey to the Red Cliffs seemed longer than ever before, each sound in the darkness making her jump. When she finally reached the small cave, Chaska was awake, sitting at the entrance, staring at the stars. "Ruth," he said, standing up with only a slight wince. His leg was healing well. "What's wrong?" "There's a posse forming," she said breathlessly. "They're looking for you. They're saying you killed a man and burned his homestead." Chaska's face went still. "Frank Donovan's brother. You know him." "I know of him." "Robert Donovan." Chaska's voice was grim. He and 3 other men have been raiding Cheyenne camps, stealing horses, burning lodges. 2 children died in the last fire they set. Ruth felt sick. So it's true, you killed him? No. Chaska's eyes met hers, unflinching. I confronted him. We fought. He fell and hit his head on a rock. It was not my intention for him to die. He paused. The fire started when one of his own torches fell during our struggle. I tried to pull him out, but he was already gone. His friends saw me leaving and assumed the worst. Relief flooded through Ruth, followed by fear. No one will believe that, not in Barrel Creek. You need to leave tonight. Chaska nodded. I've stayed too long already. He reached for her hand. Come with me. The words hung in the air between them. Ruth stared at him, caught off guard. I can't, she whispered, though something inside her cried out to say yes. My family. I understand, Chaska said, releasing her hand. Family bonds are sacred. I would not ask you to break them if I didn't believe... He stopped, then continued more softly. If I didn't believe we were meant to find each other. Ruth felt tears threatening. She handed him the basket. Take this. There's enough food for several days. Thank you. He took the basket, then reached into a small pouch at his waist. I have something else for you. He placed a second pendant in her palm, identical to the first, but stained a deep red. The feather of truth. When you wear both together, no lie can touch your heart. Ruth closed her fingers around it, treasuring the weight of it in her hand. Will I see you again? If it is meant to be. Chaska touched her cheek gently. I will. Wait at the bend in the river, where the 3 tall pines stand, for 3 days. If you choose to come, I will be there. The tenderness in his touch made her breath catch. This man, who had every reason to hate people like her father, looked at her with such warmth it made her chest ache. I should go, she said reluctantly. Be safe, and you. Ruth turned to leave, then looked back one last time. Chaska stood tall against the night sky, his silhouette strong and dignified. Something tugged at her heart, a feeling she couldn't name. She hurried back through the darkness, her mind churning with thoughts. She'd never considered leaving Barrel Creek before. Her life was here, taking care of her father and brother, maintaining their home, following the path laid out for her. But now, for the first time, she imagined something different, something free. The house was dark and quiet when she returned. Ruth slipped in through the kitchen door, relieved to find everything as she'd left it. She removed her shawl and was about to head upstairs when a match struck, illuminating the room with sudden harsh light. Sheriff Harlan Wyatt sat at the kitchen table, his face carved from stone. Beside him on the table lay her shawl, dirty from the journey, and a small cloth bundle. Looking for these? He asked, his voice dangerously soft as he unwrapped the bundle to reveal the 2 bone pendants. Ruth froze, her heart stopping in her chest. She'd left them hidden beneath her pillow, which meant he'd been in her room searching through her things. Father, I can explain. Can you? Harlan stood slowly, his tall frame blocking the doorway to the rest of the house. Can you explain why my daughter, my flesh and blood, is sneaking out in the middle of the night to meet with a murderer? A savage who killed a white man and burned his home. It wasn't like that, Ruth said, finding her voice. Chaska didn't murder anyone. It was self-defense. Robert Donovan was raiding Cheyenne camps, burning their homes. Children died, Father. Harlan's face darkened. So it's Chaska now, is it? And you believe his lies over the word of decent folk? I believe what I know in my heart to be true, Ruth said, standing straighter. And I know he's not what you think. Her father stepped closer, his anger a physical presence in the room. Do you have any idea what you've done? How this will look when people find out? My own daughter consorting with an Indian, betraying her own kind. He's a person, Father, just like you and me. Harlan slammed his hand on the table, making her jump. He is nothing like us. And you... His voice broke, raw with a mixture of fury and something that might have been fear. You want to act like a traitor? You'll sit like one till you remember your name. He grabbed her arm, his grip painfully tight, and pulled her toward the door that led to the cellar. Ruth struggled against him, but he was too strong. Father, stop, please listen to me. But Harlan wasn't listening. He opened the cellar door and pushed her toward the stairs. You'll stay down there until you... Come to your senses, until you remember you're a Wyatt, and what that means in this town. Father, the door slammed shut and Ruth heard the heavy bolt slide into place. Darkness enveloped her, the cool, damp air of the cellar wrapping around her like a shroud. She stood frozen for a moment, then slowly made her way down the wooden steps, feeling her way in the blackness. The cellar was small, used for storing preserves and root vegetables. There was a single, narrow window high on one wall, letting in a thin beam of moonlight. Ruth sat on an old crate, her mind reeling. Her father had never locked her up before. He'd been strict, yes, demanding obedience, expecting perfection, but never this. This was different. This was fear, and suddenly, with perfect clarity, Ruth understood something about her father that she never had before. His rules, his control, his insistence on order, they all came from fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of what he couldn't control, fear of a world that didn't fit into his narrow view of right and wrong. For the first time in her life, Ruth felt sorry for him, but pity wouldn't open that door. And as the minutes stretched into hours, as she sat alone in the dark cellar, Ruth made a decision. She wouldn't beg. She wouldn't apologize for following her heart. She would escape. Chaska would wait for her at the 3 tall pines. 3 days, he'd said, and she would be there. Ruth looked up at the small cellar window, measuring it with her eyes. It would be a tight fit, but she was small. She could make it through. She just needed something to stand on, something to break the glass. As the first light of dawn filtered through the window, Ruth began to search the cellar, determination hardening in her chest. Her father thought he was teaching her a lesson about loyalty. Instead, he'd given her the push she needed to find her own path. Upstairs, she could hear movement, Jude's footsteps, then her father's heavier tread. Voices, muffled by the thick cellar door. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. Argument. Confusion. Ruth continued her search, finding an old wooden stool buried behind some barrels. She tested its strength. It would hold her weight. Now she just needed to wait for nightfall when her father would be asleep. She thought of Chaska waiting by the river, of the way his eyes held hers, seeing something in her that no one else ever had. "I'm coming," she whispered to the empty cellar. "Wait for me." Outside, the sun climbed higher in the sky over Barrel Creek. Another hot, dusty day was beginning. But for Ruth Wyatt, something else was dawning. Something that felt like freedom. The cellar grew warmer as the day progressed, the small window letting in a rectangle of sunlight that slowly moved across the dirt floor. Ruth sat on the wooden stool listening to the movements above. Her father had left early, his footsteps heavy with anger. Jude had tried to speak to her through the door before he left, his voice low and worried. "Ruth, are you all right?" "I'm fine," she'd called back. "Don't worry about me." "Father's gathering men. They're going to search for Chaska." Ruth's heart had clenched at those words. She prayed Chaska was already far from the red cliffs, moving north towards safety. Now as noon approached, the house was silent. Ruth moved to the small window, standing on tiptoe to peer out. She could see the edge of the garden, the chicken coop, and beyond that, the dusty road leading to town. No one was in sight. She tested the window, pushing against it. It was stuck from years of disuse, the wood frame swollen and tight. But it wasn't locked. With enough force, she might be able to open it. Ruth searched the cellar again, looking for something she could use as a tool. Behind a stack of crates, she found an old metal garden trowel, its handle worn smooth from use. It would have to do. She wedged the trowel into the gap between the window and its frame, working it back and forth. The wood creaked in protest. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she worked, her arms aching from the effort. Just when she was about to give up, the window suddenly gave way, opening with a groan. Fresh air rushed in and Ruth closed her eyes, breathing deeply. Freedom was so close she could taste it. But the opening was high on the wall, and even with the stool, she wasn't sure she could pull herself up and through. She needed help. She needed Jude. Hours passed, the sun climbing high, then beginning its descent. Ruth heard her father return briefly in the afternoon, his boots heavy on the porch. He didn't come to the cellar door. After a few minutes, he left. Again. The posse would be combing the countryside, searching for any sign of Chaska. As dusk fell, Ruth heard the kitchen door open and close softly. Light footsteps crossed the floor above. "Ruth?" Jude's voice whispered through the cellar door. "Are you there?" "Yes." She rushed to the door. "Jude, help me get out. I need to warn Chaska." There was a pause. "Father took the key with him." Ruth's heart sank. Then she had an idea. "The window. I got it open, but I can't reach it. If you go outside, you can help pull me through." Another pause. "All right, wait there." A few minutes later, Jude's face appeared at the cellar window, pale in the gathering darkness. "Hurry," he said, reaching his arms through the opening. "Father's at the saloon with the posse, but he could be back any time." Ruth pushed the stool beneath the window and climbed up. It was a tight fit, but with Jude pulling and her pushing, she managed to squeeze through, tumbling onto the ground outside. "Thank you," she gasped, brushing dirt from her dress. Jude helped her to her feet, his young face serious in the twilight. "What now? You can't go back in the house. Father will just lock you up again." Ruth straightened her shoulders. "I'm going to find Chaska. He's waiting for me." "You're really leaving? Leaving Barrel Creek? Leaving us?" There was hurt in Jude's voice, but also something else. Understanding. "I have to," Ruth said, gripping her brother's hand. "You know what will happen if I stay. Father will never understand. He'll either keep me locked up until I agree to forget Chaska, or he'll marry me off to the first man who asks." "But where will you go?" "I don't know yet, but Chaska knows how to survive. We'll find a place." She squeezed his hand. "Come with us." Jude shook his head slowly. "I can't. Not yet. But someday." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the 2 bone pendants. "I found these on Father's desk. I thought you might want them back." Ruth took the pendants, tears filling her eyes. "I'll come back for you when I can, I promise." "I know." Jude embraced her quickly. "You need to hurry. Take Dusty." Dusty was their old mare, gentle and steady. "She's already saddled in the barn. I packed some supplies in the saddlebags, food, a blanket, some money I've been saving." Ruth stared at her brother, realizing he'd planned this all along. "Jude, I can't take your money." "Yes, you can. Now go, before someone sees us." They hurried to the barn together, keeping low and in the shadows. Dusty whickered softly as they entered, her dark eyes calm in the dimness. "There's a full moon tonight," Jude said, helping Ruth mount. "You'll be able to see the trail. Head east along the river, like you said." Ruth leaned down from the saddle to kiss her brother's forehead. "Take care of yourself. Don't let Father's anger fall on you." "I won't. I'll tell him I had no idea you were planning to escape." Jude stepped back, his lanky frame silhouetted in the barn doorway. "Be happy, Ruth. Be free." With a last look at her brother, Ruth urged Dusty forward. The mare trotted out of the barn and across the yard, her hooves muffled in the soft dirt. As soon as they reached the road, Ruth turned east toward the river and broke into a gallop. The night air was cool against her face, the moonlight turning the landscape silver. Ruth felt a wild exhilaration as she rode, a sense of liberation she'd never known before. For the first time in her life, she was making her own choice, following her own heart. She rode hard for an hour, following the winding path of the river. When she reached a fork in the trail, she slowed, trying to remember Chaska's directions. The 3 tall pines would be at the bend in the river. She took the right fork, the one that stayed closest to the water. Another hour passed. The moon climbed higher, casting deep shadows beneath the trees. Ruth began to worry she'd taken a wrong turn. Then, as she rounded a bend, she saw them, 3 massive pine trees standing sentinel on a small rise above the river. She slowed Dusty to a walk, her heart pounding. Would Chaska be there? Had he waited as he promised? The clearing beneath the pines was empty, bathed in moonlight. Ruth dismounted, leading Dusty to the river to drink. Had she misunderstood? Was this even the right place? "Chaska?" she called softly, not daring to raise her voice too much. "Are you here?" Silence answered her. She stood alone in the clearing, doubt creeping in. Had she given up everything? Her home, her father, her life in Barrel Creek for nothing? Then a shadow detached itself from the trees. Ruth spun around, her hand flying to her throat. Chaska stood at the edge of the clearing, a dark silhouette against the darker forest. For a long moment neither of them moved. "I didn't let myself believe you would come," he said finally, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. "Even though I waited." Ruth moved toward him, her feet seeming to find their own way. "I had to come. There was no choice, not really." He stepped into the moonlight and she could see his face clearly now, the strong lines of his jaw, the steadiness of his gaze. He wore a fringed buckskin shirt and leggings, a knife at his belt, a small pack slung over one shoulder. "Your father?" he asked. "He locked me in the cellar when he found out I'd been helping you. Jude helped me escape." Ruth touched the pendants hanging around her neck. "They're forming a posse to hunt for you. They think you murdered Robert Donovan, in cold blood." Chaska's expression hardened. "I told you what happened. It was not murder. I believe you." Ruth reached for his hand, her fingers closing around his. "But they won't. Not in Barrel Creek." His hand was warm and strong in hers. "Then we go north. My people have camps in the high country. We will be safe there." The simplicity of it. "We go north, we will be safe," made Ruth's throat tighten with emotion. This man spoke of "we" as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if their paths joining was meant to be. "I've never been more than a day's ride from Barrel Creek," she admitted. "I don't know anything about surviving in the wild." Chaska's eyes softened. "But you know how to be brave, how to follow your heart. The rest I can teach you." They made camp by the river that night, in a small hollow protected from the wind. Chaska built a fire, keeping it small and smokeless. Ruth tended to Dusty, unsaddling the mare and brushing her down before securing her to a low branch with enough lead to graze. "Your brother is a good man," Chaska said as they sat by the fire sharing the food Jude had packed. "To help you like this." "He is," Ruth agreed, thinking of Jude's quiet strength, so different from their father's rigid authority. "He's always seen things differently than father, more clearly somehow. And what of your mother? You speak little of her." Ruth stared into the flames. "She died 6 years ago. Fever took her." She paused, memories washing over her. "She was gentle, but strong in her own way. She used to tell me, 'Don't ever speak your heart too loud.' I think she was trying to protect me from father's disappointment." "And now? Do you speak your heart loud?" Ruth looked up, meeting his gaze across the fire. "I'm learning to." They talked long into the night. Chaska told her more about his people, about growing up torn between two worlds, the traditional ways, of the Cheyenne and the white man's education forced upon him at the mission school. "They thought they could change us, by changing our clothes, our language, our names," he said. "But the spirit cannot be changed from the outside." "Is Chaska your real name?" Ruth asked. "It is the name my father gave me. It means first son in our language." He smiled slightly. "At the school they called me Charles." "I prefer Chaska," Ruth said, returning his smile. As the fire burned down to embers, a chill crept into the air. Ruth wrapped her arms around herself, trying not to shiver. Without a word, Chaska moved to sit beside her, draping his blanket over both their shoulders. The warmth of him next to her made her breath catch. "We should sleep," he said softly. "Tomorrow we ride north." Ruth nodded, suddenly aware of how close he was, of the steady rise and fall of his chest, of the faint scent of pine and smoke that clung to him. "Ruth," he said, his voice low, "I would not have you regret your choice." She turned to look at him, their faces inches apart. "I don't. I won't." His eyes searched hers, looking for doubt, for fear. Finding none, he nodded once, satisfied. "Sleep now. I will keep watch." Ruth lay down by the fire, Chaska's blanket still wrapped around her. Despite her exhaustion, sleep was slow to come. Her mind raced with images of her father's anger, Jude's worried face, the uncertain future stretching before her. But beneath these thoughts was a current of something new, a sense of rightness, of purpose. She was following her heart wherever it might lead. Dawn came with a chorus of birdsong and the gentle rushing of the river. Ruth woke to find Chaska already up, tending a small morning fire. He'd caught 2 fish and was cooking them on flat rocks at the fire's edge. "You should have woken me," Ruth said, sitting up and smoothing her rumpled dress. "I could have helped. You needed rest." Chaska handed her a tin cup filled with strong black coffee from the supplies Jude had packed. "We have a long journey ahead." They ate quickly, the fish tender and flavorful. As they packed up camp, Ruth felt a flutter of anxiety. This was real. She was really leaving her old life behind. "How far north are we going?" she asked, helping Chaska douse the fire. 3 days' ride, maybe 4. There's a valley in the mountains where my mother's family has a camp. We'll be safe there until we decide what to do next. The casual way he spoke of their future together made Ruth's heart warm. No man had ever included her in "we" this way before, as an equal in decision-making. They were just preparing to leave when Dusty's ears pricked forward, her head turning sharply to the south. A moment later, Ruth heard it too, the distant sound of hoofbeats coming their way. Chaska moved quickly, throwing dirt over the remains of their fire. "Mounted men," he said, his voice tense. "At least 3, maybe more." "The posse," Ruth whispered, fear gripping her. "They must have followed my trail." Chaska's face hardened. "Take Dusty and ride north along the river. Don't stop until you reach the Red Rock Canyon. Wait for me there." "What about you?" "I'll lead them away, then circle back." Ruth shook her head fiercely. "No, we stay together." "Ruth, I didn't come this far to abandon you at the first sign of trouble." She grabbed Dusty's reins. "We can both ride. She's strong enough to carry us both for a while." The hoofbeats were growing louder. They had minutes at most. Chaska stared at her for a heartbeat, then nodded sharply. "Mount up, I'll ride behind you." They were on Dusty and moving before the posse came into view, the mare picking her way quickly through the trees along the riverbank. Ruth could hear shouts behind them now, voices calling to each other as they discovered the campsite. "There!" "Tracks heading north." Chaska's arms tightened around Ruth's waist. "Faster," he urged, and Dusty broke into a gallop, her hooves thundering on the hard-packed earth. The chase was on. They rode hard, pushing Dusty to her limits. The mare was strong but carrying double weight, and Ruth could feel her beginning to tire. Behind them, the posse was gaining ground, their fresher horses eating up the distance. "We can't outrun them," Ruth gasped, as they cleared a small rise and saw the river curving ahead, cutting across their path. "We don't need to outrun them," Chaska said in her ear. "Just reach the canyon. There are caves there, places to hide." The Red Rock Canyon loomed ahead, its steep walls rising on either side of the river. They plunged into the entrance, Dusty's sides heaving with exertion. The canyon narrowed quickly, the river rushing through its center, leaving only a narrow strip of bank on either side. Behind them, the first riders of the posse appeared at the canyon entrance. "There they are," a voice shouted. "I see them." A gunshot cracked, the bullet whining off the canyon wall above their heads. "Stop shooting." "You fool," another voice commanded. "That's the sheriff's daughter." Ruth recognized that second voice with a chill. Frank Donovan, brother of the man Chaska had fought with. Chaska guided Dusty deeper into the canyon, where the walls closed in even tighter. "There," he said, pointing to a narrow cleft in the rock face. "We can hide the horse there and climb up to the caves." They dismounted quickly, leading Dusty into the cleft. It was barely wide enough for the mare, but she squeezed through, trembling with exhaustion. Beyond the narrow entrance was a small box canyon, hidden from the main passage, with grass and a small spring bubbling from the rock. "She'll be safe." "Here," Chaska said, patting Dusty's neck. "Come." He led Ruth to the side of the box canyon, where a series of narrow ledges formed a natural staircase up the rock face. They climbed quickly, Ruth's heart pounding with fear and exertion. 20 feet up, Chaska pulled her into a shallow cave, its entrance partially hidden by a scrubby juniper growing from a crack in the rock. They pressed themselves against the back wall, listening. The posse had entered the canyon, their horses' hooves clattering on the rocky ground. Voices echoed off the stone walls. "They can't have gone far. Check every side passage. Spread out. They're here somewhere." Ruth held her breath as footsteps approached the cleft leading to their hiding place. There was a pause, then a voice called out, Nothing here, just solid rock. The footsteps moved away. Ruth exhaled slowly, her body shaking with relief. For hours they huddled in the cave, listening as the posse searched the canyon. The sun climbed high, beating down on the red rocks, turning the canyon into an oven. Ruth's throat grew parched, her lips dry and cracking. "Here," Chaska whispered, offering her his water skin. Small sips. The water was warm but welcome. Ruth drank gratefully, then passed it back. "Will they give up?" "Eventually. When the sun starts to set, they'll have to leave the canyon. It's too dangerous to be caught here after dark. And then? Then we continue north, but not along the river. They'll expect that. We'll go through the high country, where the horses can't follow easily." Ruth nodded, trusting his knowledge. She leaned her head against his shoulder, suddenly overwhelmed by the events of the past day. "I never thought I'd be running from my own father." Chaska's arm slipped around her shoulders, holding her close. "The path to freedom is rarely straight or easy. Is that what this is? Freedom? What would you call it?" Ruth considered the question. "Choice," she said finally. "The right to choose my own path, my own heart." Chaska's eyes softened as he looked at her. "Then it is worth the cost." As he'd predicted, the sounds of the search began to fade as the afternoon waned. The posse had been thorough, checking every accessible part of the canyon, but they hadn't found the hidden box canyon or spotted the cave high on the wall. "They're leaving," Chaska said, peering carefully out of the cave entrance. "2 men at the canyon mouth. Watching. The rest are heading back." Ruth moved to look over his shoulder. In the distance, she could see riders moving away from the canyon, heading south toward Barrel Creek. Her father would be among them, his face set in that hard, unforgiving expression she knew so well. What would he do when he returned home? Would he disown her completely? The thought brought a pang of sadness, but not regret. She'd made her choice. They waited until dusk before descending to check on Dusty. The mare had recovered somewhat, drinking from the spring and grazing on the sparse grass, but she was still tired from the hard ride. "We'll rest here tonight," Chaska decided. "Start fresh in the morning." They made a cold camp, not risking a fire. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped rapidly, the desert night bringing a chill that seeped into Ruth's bones. She sat with her back against the rock wall, Chaska beside her, both wrapped in the blanket Jude had packed. "Tell me about the place we're going," Ruth said, seeking distraction from the cold and her worries. "What is it like?" "Beautiful," Chaska replied, his voice warm with memory. "A valley nestled between 2 mountain ridges, with a clear lake at its center. Pine forests on the slopes, meadows filled with wildflowers in the spring. My mother's people have camped there for generations. Will they welcome me?" The question had been gnawing at her. "A white woman." Chaska was silent for a moment. "Some will, some won't. But my grandmother is the elder, and her word carries weight. She is a wise woman who judges people by their actions, not their blood. And what will she think of my actions? Running away with a man I barely know?" A smile touched his lips. "She will think you have courage, and perhaps that you are a little foolish." Ruth couldn't help but laugh. She might be right about that. She usually is. Chaska's hand found hers beneath the blanket, his fingers twining with hers. "But she also believes in following the path. The spirits lay before us, and I believe they laid you in my path for a reason, Ruth Wyatt." The way he said her name with such quiet conviction made her heart flutter. What reason? Perhaps to teach me that not all white people are like those who burned our camps and stole our children for their schools. Perhaps to show me that courage comes in many forms. His eyes met hers in the darkness. Or perhaps simply because 2 hearts recognized each other, despite everything that should have kept them apart. Ruth felt a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the blanket. Slowly, giving him time to pull away if he wished, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle, questioning at first, then deepening as Chaska's free hand came up to cup her cheek. When they finally broke apart, Ruth felt breathless, as if she'd been running. "I've never done that before," she admitted softly. "Kissed a man, kissed anyone." Chaska's thumb traced the line of her cheekbone. "Then I am honored to be the first." They slept curled together for warmth, Chaska's arms around Ruth, her head tucked against his chest. Despite the hard ground and the uncertain future, Ruth slept more peacefully than she had in years. Morning came with a soft rain, unusual for that time of year. They took it as a good sign, a blessing for their journey. The rain would soften their tracks, making them harder to follow, and would replenish the water sources along their route. They left the box canyon as soon as there was enough light to see Chaska leading Dusty, Ruth walking beside him. The mare could carry their supplies, but they would travel on foot for now, giving her time to recover her strength. The day passed in steady travel, Chaska setting a pace that Ruth could maintain. They left the canyon behind, climbing into the foothills that led to the mountains beyond. Chaska pointed out plants and tracks as they went, teaching Ruth the basics of survival in the wilderness. "This one is good for fever," he said, showing her a small plant with yellow flowers. "And this one helps stop bleeding." Ruth absorbed everything, asking questions, learning. This new world, so different from the structured life she'd known in Barrel Creek, both frightened and exhilarated her. By nightfall, they had covered a considerable distance. Chaska found a sheltered spot for their camp, a small hollow surrounded by thick bushes that would hide the light of their fire. "Tomorrow we cross into Cheyenne territory," he told her as they ate a simple meal of jerky and dried fruit. "The land will change. Fewer trees, more open plains." "Will your people be watching for strangers?" "Yes, but they know me, and they will." "See, you are with me willingly." Ruth nodded, hoping he was right. The thought of meeting his people made her nervous. Would they see her only as the daughter of the white sheriff who enforced laws against them, or would they give her a chance to prove herself, as Chaska had? "What will we do, Chaska?" she asked suddenly. "After we reach your grandmother's camp, we can't hide forever." He poked at the fire with a stick, his face thoughtful in the flickering light. "No, we can't. Sooner or later we must face the truth about what happened with Robert Donovan." "The truth?" Ruth frowned. "You told me what happened. It was an accident." "Yes, but your father and his posse don't know that. And Frank Donovan has reason to want me blamed for his brother's death." "What reason?" Chaska's expression darkened. "The Donovan brothers have been trying to drive my people from this territory for years. They want the land for their cattle." "Robert was the worst of them. He led the raids on our camps." Ruth felt sick at the thought. "And no one stopped them? The army? The Indian agents?" A bitter smile crossed Chaska's face. "Who would believe us over white ranchers? The agent at the reservation is paid to keep us contained, not to protect us." The injustice of it burned in Ruth's chest. "So what do we do?" "There is a white man, a journalist from the East, who has been writing about the treatment of my people. He came to the reservation last spring asking questions, taking notes. He believes in truth. You think he would help us, if we can find him?" "Last I heard, he was in Fort Collins working for a newspaper there." Ruth considered this. "So we go to your grandmother's camp first, then try to find this journalist?" Chaska nodded. "First we make sure you are safe, then we seek justice." Reached across the fire to take her hand. "But Ruth, it will be dangerous. Frank Donovan has friends, influence, and your father—" "My father made his choice," Ruth said firmly. "Just as I made mine." Later, as they prepared for sleep, Ruth thought about her father. Despite everything, she couldn't hate him. He was a product of his time, his beliefs shaped by a lifetime of seeing the world in terms of us and them, right and wrong, with no room for the complicated truths that lay in between. But she couldn't be that way anymore. Not after meeting Chaska. Not after seeing the world through his eyes, even for this short time. As she drifted towards sleep, Chaska's arm warm around her waist, Ruth touched the bone pendants at her throat, the feather of protection and the feather of truth. Together they represented everything she was fighting for now: safety and honesty, courage and clarity. Whatever came next, she would face it with open eyes and an open heart. Meanwhile, in Barrel Creek, Sheriff Harlan Wyatt sat alone in his darkened house, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table before him. The posse had returned empty-handed, their failure burning like acid in his gut. His daughter was gone. Run off with an Indian. The thought was almost too much to bear. "Sheriff?" A knock at the door roused him from his dark thoughts. It was Deputy Tom Rollins. "Frank Donovan's here to see you." Harlan straightened in his chair, forcing his mind to focus through the whiskey haze. "Send him in." Frank Donovan entered, his tall frame filling the doorway. At 40, he was one of the most powerful men in the territory, owner of the largest cattle ranch for 100 miles. "Wyatt," he said, nodding curtly. "Sorry about your daughter." Harlan grunted in response. He and Frank had never been friends, despite their shared interest in keeping order and keeping the Indians in their place. "Thing is," Frank continued, "this isn't just about your girl anymore. That Indian she's with killed my brother, burned his homestead with him in it." "We don't know that for sure," Harlan said, surprising himself with the words. When had he started to doubt, Frank's eyes narrowed. "You calling me a liar, Sheriff?" "I'm saying we need proof before we hang a man." Harlan stood up, swaying slightly. "Even an Indian, I got all the proof I need, and I aim to see justice done with or without your badge behind it." Frank moved closer, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "You might want to think about which side you're on, Wyatt. Your daughter's made her choice, now you make yours." With that, he turned and left, the door slamming behind him. Harlan sank back into his chair, his head in his hands. Which side was he on? For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure. In the doorway to the kitchen, Jude stood silently, watching his father with troubled eyes. He'd heard everything, and he knew with a certainty that settled cold in his stomach that Frank Donovan wasn't going to wait for proof or justice. He was going to hunt down Chaska and Ruth, and he was going to make sure neither of them lived, to tell their side of the story. Jude slipped back to his room, a plan already forming in his mind. He might not be able to stop what was coming, but he could at least warn his sister. Tomorrow, while his father nursed his whiskey headache, Jude would ride out, not with the posse but on his own. North, following the trail he knew Ruth and Chaska would take. It was time for him to make a choice too. Dawn broke over the rolling hills with streaks of pink and gold. Ruth woke to find Chaska already up, scanning the horizon with watchful eyes. "Should move," he said when he noticed she was awake. "We're still too close to Beryl Creek." They ate a quick breakfast of dried meat, and the last of the bread Jude had packed, then set off again. The terrain grew steeper as they climbed, forests giving way to rocky slopes and high meadows. Dusty followed faithfully, carrying their meager supplies. By midday, they had reached a high ridge. Chaska stopped, gesturing for Ruth to join him at a rocky outcrop. Below them stretched a vast landscape of rolling plains, dotted with distant herds of buffalo and bisected by a winding river that gleamed like silver in the sunlight. "Cheyenne land," he said, pride evident in his voice. "My grandmother's camp is near that bend in the river where the cottonwoods grow thick." Ruth shaded her eyes, trying to see what he pointed to. It looked so far away, and yet they had already come so much farther than she'd ever imagined she could. "How long until we reach it?" "Tomorrow, if we keep a good pace. We'll camp tonight in those foothills." He indicated a cluster of low hills at the base of the mountain they were descending. As they made their way down the steep trail, Ruth's thoughts turned to Beryl Creek. What was happening there now? Had her father sent more men after them? Was Jude safe? The questions gnawed at her, but she pushed them aside. She had made her choice. There was no going back. They traveled steadily through the afternoon, Chaska setting a pace that was challenging but manageable for Ruth. He showed her how to move quietly through the forest, how to read the signs of animals and weather in the world around them. "There," he said, pointing to a patch of disturbed earth beside the trail. "Elk passed here this morning, a mother and young calf." Ruth marveled at his knowledge. "How can you tell?" "The depth of the tracks, the spacing. See how these prints are smaller and stay close to the larger ones. The calf never strays far from its mother." She nodded, trying to see what he saw. Slowly, the forest was coming alive for her in a new way, revealing secrets she'd never noticed before. As the sun began to set, they made camp in a small clearing among the foothills. Ruth gathered wood while Chaska set snares for rabbits. By nightfall, they had a small fire and a modest meal cooking. "Tell me more about your grandmother," Ruth said as they sat by the fire. "What is she like?" A smile softened Chaska's features. "She is like the mountains, old, strong, unchanging. She was a great beauty in her youth, or so they say. She married a war chief and bore him 5 sons before he was killed fighting the Crow. What's her name? In your language, it would be Morning Star. But we call her grandmother out of respect. He poked at the fire with a stick. She was against the mission schools. She fought when they came to take the children, but they threatened to withhold food rations if the families didn't comply. Ruth felt a familiar pang of shame for what her people had done. I'm sorry. It wasn't your doing. Chaska reached for her hand across the fire. Just as what Robert Donovan did wasn't my doing. We are not our people's worst deeds. His words eased something in Ruth's heart. Do you think your grandmother will accept me? She will see your heart as I have. His grip on her hand tightened, and she will know you are where you belong. Later, as they lay side by side beneath the stars, Ruth found herself thinking of her mother. What would Sarah Wyatt have thought of her daughter's choices? Would she have understood, or would she have been as unyielding as Harlan? What are you thinking? Chaska asked softly, his arm warm around her shoulders. About my mother, wondering what she would think of all this. What kind of woman was she? Ruth considered the question. Quiet but not weak. She stood up to my father in her own way. Not openly, that wasn't her style, but she had her methods. A memory surfaced, bringing a smile to Ruth's lips. Once, when I was 12, I wanted to go fishing with the boys from town. Father said no, that it wasn't proper for a young lady. But Mother somehow convinced him to change his mind. I never knew what she said to him. But the next day, he told me I could go if I finished all my chores first. She sounds wise. She was, Ruth sighed. I think she would have liked you. Chaska's chest rumbled with a soft laugh. I doubt your father would agree. No, Ruth admitted. But Mother saw things he didn't, or couldn't. They fell silent, listening to the night sounds around them, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of wind through the trees, the crackling of their small fire. It was peaceful in a way Barrel Creek had never been, with its constant hum of human activity and judgment. Chaska, Ruth said after a while, what will happen when we reach your grandmother's camp? Will we stay there? For a time, until we can. Find that journalist I told you about, the one who might help us tell the truth about Robert Donovan. And after that, he was quiet for a moment. What do you want, Ruth, after the truth is known? It was a question she hadn't fully considered until now. What did she want for her future? For their future? I want to be free, she said finally. Free to choose my own path, to love who I love without shame or fear. She turned to face him in the firelight. I want to be with you, wherever that takes us. Chaska's eyes were dark and steady as they held hers. Even if it means never returning to the white man's world? Never seeing your brother again? The thought of never seeing Jude again sent a sharp pain through Ruth's heart. I don't know, she admitted. I hope it doesn't come to that. I hope someday, when the truth is known, we can go where we choose. Your world or mine or somewhere in between. A hope worth holding, Chaska said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. But for now we must deal with what is, not what might be. Ruth nodded, knowing he was right. They had more immediate concerns. Reaching the safety of his grandmother's camp, finding the journalist, clearing Chaska's name. The future beyond that was a luxury they couldn't afford to dwell on yet. She leaned forward and kissed him, a gentle press of lips that deepened as he pulled her closer. In his arms, the worries of tomorrow seemed distant, unimportant compared to the warmth and rightness of being with him now. Morning came with a sense of anticipation. They were close to the Cheyenne camp now, and Chaska's steps grew lighter, more eager as they descended into the plains. By midday, they could see the river clearly, a sparkling ribbon winding through the tall grass. There, Chaska said, pointing to a stand of cottonwoods in the distance. The camp is just beyond those trees. Ruth felt a flutter of nervousness. What would Chaska's people think of her? Would they welcome her, or see her only as the enemy? As they approached the cottonwoods, Chaska stopped suddenly, his body tensing. Something's wrong, he said, his voice low and urgent. What is it? The camp. There should be smoke from cooking fires, people moving about. He stared at the tree line, his expression growing grim. It's too quiet. They moved forward more cautiously now, Chaska leading Ruth and Dusty through the tall grass rather than along the more visible trail. When they reached the edge of the cottonwood grove, he motioned for her to stay back while he scouted ahead. Ruth waited anxiously, every minute feeling like an hour. Finally, Chaska returned, his face a mask of controlled anger. "The camp is gone," he said flatly. "They've moved on." "All of them? Why?" "There was a raid." He gestured for her to follow him. "Come, I'll show you." They left Dusty tied to a tree and moved through the cottonwoods on foot. Beyond the trees lay a clearing where circular depressions in the earth showed where teepees had once stood. Scattered about were discarded items, a broken cooking pot, a child's doll made of corn husks, a tattered blanket, and everywhere the signs of a hasty departure. "White men came," Chaska said, kneeling to examine marks in the dirt. "On horseback, armed." Ruth felt sick. "How can you tell?" "Boot prints, horseshoes different from ours. And this." He picked up a spent cartridge, holding it up for her to see. "Army rifles. Did they hurt anyone?" "I don't think so. No blood, no bodies. My people fled before they arrived." He stood, scanning the horizon. "They would have gone north, to the hidden valley I told you about. It's a sacred place, hard to find if you don't know the way." "How far?" 2 days' journey, maybe 3. Chaska's jaw tightened. "We should hurry. If white men are hunting my people again—" He didn't finish the thought, but Ruth understood. If the raids had started again, nowhere was truly safe. They retrieved Dusty and set off immediately, following a faint trail that led northward along the river. Chaska was quiet, his earlier eagerness replaced by a tense vigilance that had him constantly scanning their surroundings. "Do you think it was the Donovans?" Ruth asked as they stopped briefly to water Dusty at the river. "Frank, looking for revenge? Perhaps. Or the army moving people back to the reservation." Chaska's voice was bitter. "It makes little difference. The result is the same." They pushed on until darkness forced them to make camp. This time Chaska wouldn't risk a fire, so they ate cold jerky and slept huddled together for warmth beneath a blanket. Dawn found them already moving, Chaska setting a faster pace than before. Ruth struggled to keep up, her muscles aching from days of unaccustomed travel, but she didn't complain. She understood the urgency driving him. By midday, they had left the river behind and were crossing a vast, open plain. The land seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, with only occasional clusters of rock or scrubby trees to break the monotony. "We're exposed here," Ruth said, glancing nervously at the empty horizon. "Anyone could see us for miles." "Yes," Chaska agreed grimly, "but it's the fastest route. The alternative would add another day to our journey." They kept moving, the hot sun beating down on them mercilessly. Ruth's lips grew cracked with thirst, her skin burning despite the shawl she'd draped over her head. Dusty plodded along, head low with exhaustion. It was Ruth who spotted the dust cloud first, a smudge on the western horizon that grew larger by the minute. "Chaska," she said, pointing. "Riders." He followed her gaze, his expression darkening. Many riders, moving fast. He scanned the terrain ahead, making a quick decision. "There's a ravine about a mile ahead. If we can reach it before they see us—" They broke into a run. Ruth leading Dusty by the reins, Chaska slightly ahead, searching for the ravine he'd mentioned. The dust cloud grew larger, resolving into a line of mounted men, at least a dozen, maybe more. "There," Chaska pointed to a break in the plain ahead, where the land fell away suddenly. "The ravine! Hurry!" They reached the edge just as a shout went up from behind them. They'd been spotted. "Down quickly," Chaska urged, helping Ruth guide Dusty down the steep slope into the ravine. It was about 15 feet deep, with a sandy bottom and steep walls. Not a perfect hiding place, but better than the open plain. They pressed themselves against the ravine wall, trying to slow their breathing. Above them, the thunder of hooves grew louder, then stopped. Male voices called to each other, too distant to make out the words. "They're searching the ravine," Chaska whispered. "We need to move." They crept along the ravine floor, staying close to the wall, leading Dusty as quietly as possible. The voices followed along the rim, keeping pace with them. Suddenly, a rider, appeared at the edge directly above them. "Here!" he shouted. "I found them!" More riders appeared, rifles aimed down into the ravine. Ruth froze, terror gripping her. This was it. They were trapped. Then a familiar voice called out, "Ruth! Is that you?" She looked up in disbelief. "Jude!" Her brother's face appeared at the ravine edge, relief washing over his features. "Thank God," he said. "I've been tracking you for days." Before Ruth could respond, more riders crowded the edge, and she saw with a shock that they weren't men from Barrel Creek at all. They were Cheyenne warriors, their faces painted for battle. Chaska stepped forward, calling up to them in his own language. A rapid exchange followed, with gestures and nods. Finally, one of the warriors, an older man with streaks of grey in his long braids, responded at length. Chaska turned to Ruth, his expression a mixture of relief and concern. "These are my people. The one speaking is my uncle, Black Hawk. He says Jude came to them 2 days ago, warning of white men hunting us. They've been searching for us since." "Jude?" Ruth looked up at her brother in amazement. "You came all this way?" Jude nodded, his young face serious. "Frank Donovan is gathering men, not just from Barrel Creek, from all over the territory. He's offering gold for Chaska's head. And—" he hesitated, glancing at the Cheyenne warriors beside him. "And what?" Ruth demanded. "And he's saying you're being held against your will." "That Chaska kidnapped you." Jude's eyes were troubled. "Father believes it, or he's trying to. It's easier for him than facing the truth that you chose to leave." Anger flared in Ruth's chest. "That's a lie. I went with Chaska willingly. I love him." The words rang out in the ravine, startling even Ruth herself. She hadn't said them before, not so plainly, but she knew they were true. One of the warriors said something to Chaska, who translated, "He says we should continue this conversation in a safer place. They have horses for us a mile back. We can reach the hidden valley by nightfall if we hurry." Ruth nodded, her heart still pounding from her declaration. Jude and the warriors led them to a spot where the ravine wall was less steep, helping them climb out with Dusty in tow. Beyond the ravine, hidden in a small copse of trees, were several spare horses. "The women and children are already at the hidden valley," Chaska explained as they mounted. "The men came back to find stragglers and to watch for pursuers." They rode hard for the rest of the day, the warriors forming a protective circle around Ruth, Chaska, and Jude. As the sun began to set, they entered a narrow pass between two rocky ridges. The path wound upward, becoming steeper and more treacherous. "Few white men know of this place," Chaska told Ruth as they navigated the difficult terrain. "It has been a sanctuary for my people in times of trouble for many generations." The pass opened suddenly onto a sight that took Ruth's breath away. Below them lay a verdant valley, cradled between mountain walls, with a crystal-clear lake at its center. Along the lakeshore and spreading into the surrounding meadows were dozens of teepees, their smoke rising in thin columns against the darkening sky. "It's beautiful," Ruth whispered. Chaska nodded, pride evident in his face. "This is the place I told you about, the Valley of our ancestors." They descended into the valley as the last light faded from the sky. Their arrival caused a stir in the camp, with people emerging from teepees to watch the returning warriors. Ruth felt the weight of curious, sometimes hostile stares as she rode beside Chaska. They dismounted near the center of the camp, where a large fire burned. An elderly woman sat beside it, wrapped in a colorful blanket despite the warm evening. Her face was deeply lined, her white hair braided with shells and beads, but her eyes were sharp and alert as they fixed on Chaska. He approached her respectfully, speaking in their language. The old woman listened, her gaze moving from Chaska to Ruth and back again. Finally she responded, her voice stronger than her frail appearance suggested. Chaska turned to Ruth and Jude. "My grandmother welcomes you to the valley. She says any friend of her grandson is under her protection." Relief washed over Ruth. At least they would be safe here for now. The next hours passed in a blur of introductions and explanations. Jude told them how he had left Barrel Creek the day after Ruth's escape, riding north in the hope of finding her, before Frank Donovan did. "I tried to talk to Father first," he said as they sat around the fire eating a stew of rabbit and wild onions. To make him see reason, but he wouldn't listen. He just kept saying we had to get you back, that you'd been taken against your will. And you didn't believe that? Ruth asked. Jude shook his head. I saw how you looked when you talked about Chaska. I knew you'd gone willingly. He glanced at Chaska, who was speaking with his uncle nearby. Besides, I've never believed all the stories about Indians being savages, not like Father does. How did you find the Cheyenne camp? Luck, mostly. I was following what I thought were your tracks when I ran into a hunting party. I think they were ready to kill me until I mentioned your name and Chaska's. Jude grinned. Turns out Chaska's pretty important around here. His father was some kind of chief. Ruth nodded, watching Chaska across the fire. There was so much about him she still didn't know, about his past, his family, his position among his people. But it didn't matter. She knew his heart, and that was enough. Later, when most of the camp had retired for the night, Morningstar beckoned Ruth to sit beside her at the fire. Chaska joined them, translating for his grandmother. She wants to know why you left your people to come with me, he said. Ruth considered her answer carefully. Tell her that I followed my heart, that I believe in truth and justice, and I couldn't stand by while an innocent man was hunted for something he didn't do, Chaska translated. The old woman listened, her eyes never leaving Ruth's face. When Chaska finished, she spoke again, her weathered hands moving expressively as she talked. She says your words are good, but she wants to know if you understand what it means to walk between two worlds, that the path you have chosen will not be easy. Ruth nodded solemnly. I understand, but some things are worth the difficulty. More translation, more response. Chaska's voice softened as he spoke his grandmother's next words. She says she sees strength in you, the kind of strength her people will need in the days to come. She gives us her blessing. Tears pricked at Ruth's eyes. She hadn't realized how much she'd needed that blessing until now. Morningstar reached out a gnarled hand, touching the bone pendants at Ruth's throat. She said something directly to Chaska, her tone questioning. She asks if I gave you these, he explained. The feathers of protection and truth. When Ruth nodded, the old woman smiled for the first time, revealing surprising white teeth. She spoke again, this time at length. She says these are powerful symbols among our people, Chaska translated. By accepting them, you have already begun to walk the Cheyenne path. She says she will teach you our ways if you wish to learn. I do, Ruth said without hesitation. Please tell her I would be honored. The conversation continued late into the night, with Morningstar sharing stories of the Cheyenne people, their beliefs and traditions. Despite the language barrier, Ruth felt a connection forming with this strong, wise woman who had endured so much yet remained unbowed. As they finally prepared to sleep, Chaska showed Ruth to a small teepee at the edge of the camp. This will be yours while we are here, he said. My grandmother insists on propriety. Ruth smiled at that. Even in this different world, some things remained the same. Grandmothers concerned with appearances and proper behavior. Where will you sleep? With the other unmarried men, on the far side of the camp. He took her hand, his touch gentle. Rest now. Tomorrow we will talk more about what comes next. And Jude? He will stay with my cousins. He is safe here. Ruth nodded, suddenly exhausted by the day's events and revelations. As Chaska turned to leave, she caught his arm. Thank you for bringing me here, for sharing your world with me. His eyes were warm in the darkness. It is my honor, Ruth Wyatt. The next days fell into a rhythm of learning and waiting. Morningstar began teaching Ruth the basics of Cheyenne life, how to prepare food in their way, how to sew with sinew and bone needles, how to identify useful plants and herbs. Despite the language barrier, the old woman was a patient teacher, demonstrating rather than explaining, guiding Ruth's hands when she struggled. Jude, meanwhile, was absorbed into the company of young Cheyenne men his age, learning to hunt and track under the guidance of Black Hawk and other warriors. He took to it with surprising ease, his natural quietness and observant nature serving him well in the wilderness. Chaska divided his time between Ruth, tribal councils with the elders, and scouting missions to monitor the surrounding territory for signs of pursuers. Each day he would return with reports. Frank Donovan's men combing the plains, army patrols moving along the river, increased activity at the nearby fort. "They're searching methodically," he told Ruth and Jude one evening as they sat by the lake away from the main camp. "Moving outward from Barrel Creek in widening circles. Eventually they'll find this valley." "How long do we have?" Jude asked. "A week, maybe 2. Chaska's face was grim. "The elders are divided. Some want to break camp and move further north into Montana territory. Others say we should stay and fight if necessary." "And you?" Ruth asked. "What do you think we should do?" Chaska was silent for a moment, skimming a stone across the lakes. "Surface, I think we need to end this, not with more fighting, but with truth." "The journalist you mentioned," Ruth remembered. "In Fort Collins?" "Yes, James Harrison. He writes for an eastern newspaper but lives in Colorado. He's been documenting the mistreatment of Indian tribes throughout the West." Chaska turned to face them, his expression resolute. "I need to find him, tell him what really happened with Robert Donovan." "We need to find him," Ruth corrected. "I'm coming with you." Chaska shook his head. "It's too dangerous. Fort Collins is a white settlement. If Frank Donovan's men are looking for us, all the more reason for me to come," Ruth insisted. "I'm white, I can move more freely than you can, and I'm a witness. I can testify that you told me about Robert Donovan's death before anyone else. Accused you, that counts for something." Jude nodded in agreement. "She's right, Chaska. Ruth has a better chance of getting to this journalist safely than you do." Chaska looked torn, clearly not liking the idea of Ruth putting herself at risk, but recognizing the logic of their arguments. "We go together," he said finally, "but in disguise. I've lived among white men enough to pass as Mexican or half-breed if I dress differently and speak little." "When do we leave?" Ruth asked. "Tomorrow, at dawn." Chaska's decision was made. "The longer we wait, the more danger comes to my people." They spent the rest of the evening preparing. Morning Star provided Ruth with Cheyenne clothing, practical buckskin leggings and a tunic that would allow her to ride more comfortably than her dress. For Chaska, Jude offered his own clothes, trousers, a cotton shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat that would hide his distinctive features. "What about me?" Jude asked as they packed supplies into saddlebags. "I want to come too." Ruth and Chaska exchanged glances. "You need to stay here," Ruth said gently. "If something happens to us, someone needs to know the truth. Someone who can tell Father." Jude didn't like it, but he understood. Before dawn the next morning, he embraced his sister tightly. "Be careful," he whispered. "Come back to us." "I will," Ruth promised. "Take care of yourself. And tell Morning Star, thank you for everything." They left as the first light touched. The eastern sky riding Dusty and a sturdy pinto pony that Blackhawk had given to Chaska. The journey to Fort Collins would take 3 days if they pushed hard. They traveled cautiously, avoiding main trails and settlements, camping in hidden spots away from likely patrol routes. Chaska's knowledge of the land proved invaluable, as did the skills Ruth had begun to learn from Morning Star. Together, they moved like shadows across the territory, drawing steadily closer to Fort Collins and the journalist, who might be their only hope for justice. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, they crested a hill and saw Fort Collins spread out below them, a growing frontier town with wooden buildings lining a main street, surrounded by farms and ranches. "We'll wait until dusk," Chaska decided. "Less chance of being recognized in the shadows." Ruth nodded, studying the town with a mixture of nervousness and determination. After days in the wilderness with the Cheyenne, the white settlement seemed both familiar and strange to her now, like a place remembered from a dream. As the sun began to set, they descended toward Fort Collins, their disguises in place. Chaska in Jude's clothes with his long hair tucked under the hat, Ruth in her buckskin tunic but with her dress packed in the saddlebag, ready to change if necessary to blend in. They entered town from the north, riding slowly down the main street as if they belonged there. Ruth kept her eyes open for the newspaper office, finally spotting a painted sign, "Fort Collins Gazette." "There," she said quietly to Chaska. "That must be where Harrison works." They dismounted, tying their horses to a hitching post outside a small hotel across from the newspaper office. The street was relatively quiet, with just a few people moving about on evening errands. "I'll go in first," Ruth said. "Ask for Harrison. If he's there, I'll bring him out to meet you. If not, I'll find out where he lives." Chaska nodded, though she could see he didn't like letting her go alone. "Be careful. If anything seems wrong, I'll leave immediately," she promised, squeezing his hand. "Wait here." Ruth crossed the street, straightening her shoulders and trying to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. The newspaper office was still, lit from within, a good sign that someone was working late. She pushed open the door, stepping into a small front room with a counter. Behind it sat a young man, barely older than Jude, scribbling in a ledger. "Excuse me," Ruth said. "I'm looking for Mr. James Harrison." The young man looked up, blinking in surprise at her appearance. A young woman in buckskin entering a newspaper office at dusk was clearly not an everyday occurrence. "Mr. Harrison's in the back," he said after a moment. "May I ask what this is regarding?" "I have information about the Cheyenne raids, information he'll want to hear." The young man's eyes widened. "Just a moment." He disappeared through a door. Behind the counter, Ruth waited tensely, ready to flee at the first sign of trouble. A minute later, the door reopened, and a tall, bearded man in his 40s emerged. He wore spectacles and had ink stains on his fingers. A working journalist, not a dandy. "I'm James Harrison," he said, studying Ruth with intelligent eyes. "My assistant says you have information about the Cheyenne." "Yes." Ruth glanced at the young assistant, who was watching with undisguised curiosity. "But I'd prefer to speak privately." Harrison nodded. "Of course, come to my office." He led her through the door to a cluttered room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large desk covered in papers. Once the door was closed, Ruth spoke quickly. "Mr. Harrison, I'm Ruth Wyatt, daughter of Sheriff Harlan Wyatt from Beryl Creek. I have information about what really happened between Robert Donovan and a Cheyenne man named Chaska." Harrison's eyebrows rose. "The sheriff's daughter? I've heard about you. The whole territory has. They're saying you were kidnapped by an Indian." "That's a lie," Ruth said firmly. "I wasn't kidnapped. I went willingly with Chaska because I know he's innocent of what they're accusing him of." "And what would that be exactly?" "Murder. They say he killed Robert Donovan in cold blood and burned his homestead, but it wasn't like that. It was self-defense. Donovan and others had been raiding Cheyenne camps, burning their lodges. Children died in those fires." Harrison's expression grew serious. He gestured to a chair. "Sit down, Miss Wyatt. I want to hear everything." "Not just from me," Ruth said. "Chaska is here too, in town. He can tell you himself what happened." "You brought him here?" Harrison sounded incredulous. "Do you know how dangerous that is? There's a bounty on his head." "We know. But we had to come. The truth has to be told before more people die." Ruth leaned forward earnestly. "Will you help us, Mr. Harrison? Will you listen to Chaska's story and publish the truth?" Harrison was silent for a long moment, considering. Then he nodded slowly. "I've been documenting Indian mistreatment for years. If what you're saying is true, it needs to be reported." He stood up. "Where is he?" "Across the street, waiting. Bring him here. Use the back door. It's less visible from the street." Ruth thanked him and slipped out the way she'd come. Crossing the street again, she found Chaska, waiting anxiously by the horses. "He'll see us," she said. "He wants us to use the back door." They led the horses around to the alley behind the newspaper office, where a small door stood partially ajar. Harrison himself met them there, ushering them quickly inside to a storeroom filled with stacks of paper and bottles of ink. "So you're Chaska," Harrison said, studying him with interest. "I've heard a lot about you in the past week." "Most of Kalais," Chaska replied, removing his hat now that they were inside. His long black hair fell free, making his Cheyenne identity unmistakable. "So I'm beginning to understand." Harrison gestured to some crates. "Sit, both of you. Tell me everything, from the beginning." For the next hour, Chaska recounted the true story of his confrontation with Robert Donovan, how he had tracked the rancher after a raid on a Cheyenne camp had left 2 children dead, how they had fought, and how Donovan had died accidentally from a fall. Ruth added her part, explaining how she had found Chaska wounded by a trap, how she had helped him, and how she had chosen to leave with him when her father refused to believe the truth. Harrison took notes throughout, occasionally, asking questions or requesting clarification. When they finished, he sat back, tapping his pencil against his notebook. "It's a powerful story," he said, "and I believe you, but belief isn't proof, and Frank Donovan has a lot of influence in this territory." "What kind of proof would you need?" Ruth asked. "Witnesses. Other Cheyenne who saw the raids, physical evidence from the burned camps, anything that corroborates your account." Chaska nodded grimly. "My uncle, Black Hawk, was there when the children died. He would speak to you." "And there are others." "Good, that's a start." Harrison closed his notebook. "I need to write this story, but it will take time to gather all the evidence to make it unassailable. And meanwhile, you two are in danger every moment you stay in this town." "We understand," Ruth said, "but we had to come to start the process of truth-telling. You did the right thing." Harrison stood up, a decision clearly made. "Listen, I have a cabin about 5 miles north of town, near the river. No one knows about it. It's where I go when I need to write without interruption. You can stay there while I gather the evidence I need." "Why would you help us this way?" Chaska asked, suspicious. "You don't know us." Harrison's face darkened with old pain. "My wife was half Cherokee. She died at Wounded Knee. I've seen firsthand what happens when lies are allowed to stand, when good people do nothing." He met Chaska's gaze squarely. "I can't bring her back, but I can tell the truth for others." Chaska nodded, accepting the explanation. "We are grateful." Harrison gave them directions to the cabin, a hand-drawn map, and the key. "I'll come tomorrow with supplies. Stay inside, keep a low profile. This town has eyes everywhere." They left through the back door as they had entered, mounting their horses and slipping out of town as darkness fell completely. Following Harrison's app, they rode north along the river, finally finding the small cabin nestled among pine trees on a low bluff. It was a simple structure, one room with a stone fireplace, a small table, a chair, and a narrow bed. But it was solid, secure, and hidden from the main trails. "We'll be safe here," Ruth said, lighting a lantern they found on the table. "At least for a while." "Until Harrison gathers his evidence," Chaska agreed, though his expression remained guarded. "If he keeps his word, I think he will." Ruth unpacked their meager supplies. "He has his own reasons for wanting justice." They settled in for the night, taking comfort in the solid walls around them after days in the open. The cabin was cold, having been empty for some time, but they soon had a small fire going in the fireplace. "What happens when this is over?" Ruth asked, as they sat before the fire. "If Harrison publishes the truth, if people believe it." Chaska was silent for a long moment. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "My people cannot go back to the old ways. Those days are gone. But we cannot live as prisoners on reservations either." "Is there no middle path?" "Perhaps. Some tribes have found ways to adapt without losing themselves entirely." He took her hand, his fingers warm against hers. "But I'm more concerned with what you want, Ruth. This is my world, my struggle. You chose to join it, but you can also choose to leave it." Ruth shook her head firmly. "I'm not leaving, not you, not this path we're on together." She met his gaze directly. "I meant what I said in the ravine. I love you, Chaska." His eyes softened and he raised her hand to his lips. "And I love you, Ruth Wyatt, more than I thought possible when I first saw you by the river." They slept that night in each other's arms, the fire dying slowly to embers, the future uncertain, but their commitment to each other unwavering. Morning brought Harrison as promised, with supplies and news. "Frank Donovan is in Fort Collins," he told them grimly. "He arrived late last night with a dozen men. They're staying at the hotel across from my office." Ruth felt a chill of fear. "Does he know we're here?" "I don't think so. Not yet. But it's only a matter of time before someone remembers seeing 2 strangers matching your description." Harrison unpacked food and fresh water from his saddlebags. "I've sent word to the Cheyenne camp asking Black Hawk to meet me, and I've started writing the story, though I won't publish until I have more evidence." "How long will that take?" Chaska asked. "A few days at least." "Maybe a week." Harrison looked troubled. The problem is, I don't think we have that long. Donovan is offering more money for information. Someone will talk eventually. Ruth and Chaska exchanged glances, both thinking the same thing. They couldn't stay hidden forever. Sooner or later, Donovan would find them. We need another plan, Ruth said. Something more direct. Like what? Harrison asked. Like confronting my father. The idea had been forming in Ruth's mind since they arrived at the cabin. He's the law in Barrel Creek. If we can convince him of the truth, he could stand against Donovan. Your father locked you in a cellar for helping me, Chaska reminded her. What makes you think he'll listen now? Because Jude will be with us. And because deep down, beneath all his prejudice and fear, my father believes in justice. Ruth turned to Harrison. Could you arrange a meeting, somewhere neutral where both sides would feel safe? Harrison considered it. There's a trading post at the junction of the North and South Trails. It's run by a man named Jenkins who has no love for the Donovans. He might agree to host such a meeting. And my father. Would he come? If he believes you'll be there. Yes, I think he would. Harrison nodded slowly, warming to the idea. It could work. A chance for all sides to speak their piece with witnesses present. I could document everything. When? Chaska asked. 2 days from now. That gives me time to arrange it and send messages. Harrison stood, preparing to leave. Stay here until... So then, don't risk being seen in town. After he left, Ruth and Chaska discussed the plan further. It was risky, bringing together her father, Chaska, and potentially Frank Donovan, but it might be their best chance to reveal the truth before more violence erupted. Are you sure about this? Chaska asked as they lay in bed that night. Your father may not be willing to listen even now. I have to try, Ruth said. He raised me to believe in truth and justice. I have to believe those weren't just empty words. The next day passed slowly, with Ruth and Chaska confined to the cabin and its immediate surroundings. They took turns keeping watch, alert for any sign that their hiding place had been discovered. By evening, Ruth was tense with waiting. I wish we knew if Harrison was successful, she said, pacing the small room. If my father agreed to the meeting. We'll know tomorrow, Chaska replied, his own calmer counterpoint to her anxiety. Try to rest, but rest was elusive for both of them. The stakes were too high, the outcome too uncertain. Dawn broke clear and cold. They were up early, preparing for whatever the day might bring. Around mid-morning, they heard a horse approaching. Chaska positioned himself by the window, knife ready while Ruth waited by the door. It was Harrison, his face drawn with fatigue, but his eyes bright with news. It's arranged, he said as they let him in. Jenkins agreed to host the meeting at his trading post, noon today. And my father? Ruth asked anxiously. He'll be there. So will Jude. He arrived in Fort Collins yesterday with 2 Cheyenne warriors. Black Hawk is coming as well. And Donovan. Chaska's voice was tense. Harrison grimaced. That's the complication. He got wind of the meeting somehow. He and his men will be there too. Ruth felt fear coil in her stomach. With Donovan present, the chance of violence increased dramatically. We don't have to go through with this, Chaska said, watching her face. We could leave, head north as we planned. Ruth shook her head. No, running won't solve anything. The lies will follow us, and your people will still be in danger. She straightened her shoulders, finding her resolve. We need to face this today. Harrison nodded approvingly. I've brought extra horses. We should leave soon to arrive before the others. They rode out within the hour, taking a circuitous route to avoid being seen from the main trail. The trading post came into view just before noon, a sturdy log building, with a wide porch situated at the junction of 2 well-traveled trails. Several horses were already tied at the hitching rail, including one Ruth recognized with a jolt of emotion, her father's big bay gelding. He's here, she murmured. They dismounted some distance away, approaching the trading post cautiously. Harrison went first, checking that it was safe for Ruth and Chaska to enter. Jenkins has cleared the main room, he reported back. Your father is inside with Jude. Black Hawk and his men are waiting around back. Donovan and 3 of his riders just arrived. They're on the porch. Ruth took a deep breath, steadying herself. Let's go. Chaska took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. Together. They walked toward the trading post, making no attempt to hide. On the porch, Frank Donovan straightened from where he'd been leaning against a post, his hand moving to the gun at his hip. "Well, well," he drawled as they approached, "the Indian and his white squaw walking right into our hands." Ruth met his gaze coolly. "We're here to talk, Mr. Donovan. That's all. Talk won't bring my brother back, girl." "No," Chaska agreed, his voice level. "But it might prevent more death." Donovan's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, the trading post door opened. Sheriff Harlan Wyatt stood in the doorway, his badge gleaming on his chest, his face like stone as he saw his daughter hand in hand with Chaska. "Ruth," he said, her name coming out rough with emotion. "Father." She didn't let go of Chaska's hand. "Thank you for coming." Harlan's gaze shifted to Chaska, hardening. "You have a lot to answer for, Indian." "Yes," Chaska agreed calmly. "As do others. That's why we're here." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then Jenkins, the trading post owner, stepped onto the porch. "This is neutral ground today," he announced firmly. "Anyone who starts trouble answers to me." He patted the shotgun cradled in his arms. "Now let's all go inside and have this talk." One by one, they filed into the trading post's main room. The usual goods had been pushed to the walls, and a large table had been placed in the center. Jude was already seated there, his face lighting up when he saw Ruth and Chaska. Black Hawk and 2 other Cheyenne warriors entered through the back door, their expressions wary but determined. Harrison took a position at one end of the table, notebook ready. Frank Donovan and his men were the last to enter, their hands never straying far from their weapons. Jenkins positioned himself by the door, shotgun ready. "Sit," he ordered. "All of you." They arranged themselves around the table, Harlan and Jude on one side, Ruth and Chaska on another, Black Hawk and his warriors opposite, Donovan and his men completing the square. "Now," Jenkins said when everyone was seated, "Mr. Harrison has called this meeting so all sides can speak their piece, one at a time without interruption. Who wants to start?" "I will," Chaska said, his voice carrying clearly in the tense silence. "I am accused of murdering Robert Donovan and burning his homestead. This is not true. I confronted him because he and others had been raiding Cheyenne camps, burning our lodges, stealing our horses. 2 children died in the last fire they set, Frank." Donovan surged to his feet. "That's a lie." "Sit down," Jenkins ordered, raising his shotgun slightly. "You'll get your turn." Reluctantly, Donovan sat back down, seething with anger. Chaska continued. "Robert Donovan and I fought. He fell and hit, his head on a rock. It was not my intention for him to die. The fire started when one of his own torches fell during our struggle. I tried to pull him out, but he was already dead." Black Hawk spoke next, with Harrison translating. He described the raids on the Cheyenne, camps, the terror of the women and children, the deaths that had resulted. He named dates, locations, specific incidents that could be verified. When he finished, Harrison addressed the room. "I've been investigating these claims for the past 2 days. I've spoken to other witnesses, both Indian and white, who confirm Black Hawk's account. The raids were real. The deaths were real." Harlan Wyatt listened to all this with a deepening frown. He had spent his life enforcing the law, believing in a clear line between right and wrong. But now that line was blurring before his eyes. "Sheriff," Harrison said, turning to him, "you've built your reputation on justice. Is it just that one man's death is avenged while the deaths of innocent children are ignored?" Harlan's gaze moved. To Ruth, then to Jude, seeing the conviction in both their faces. "You believe this?" he asked them. "Yes, Father," Ruth said firmly. "I've heard the truth from Chaska himself, from his people, and I've seen how Frank Donovan operates, how he twists facts to serve his purposes. She's been bewitched by this savage." Donovan spat. "Can't you see that, Sheriff? Your own daughter turned against her kind." "No, Mr. Donovan," Ruth said, her voice steady. "I've simply opened my eyes to a larger truth than the one I was raised with. People are people, regardless of the color of their skin or the language they speak." Jude spoke up then, his young voice surprisingly strong. "Father, you taught us that the law protects everyone equally. But that's not true, is it? Not for the Cheyenne. Not for anyone who isn't white." Harlan looked at his son with surprise, seeing a maturity there he hadn't noticed before. "When did you get so wise, boy?" When I saw my sister risk everything for what she believed was right, Jude replied simply. A heavy silence fell over the room. The tension was palpable as everyone waited for Harlan's response. As sheriff, his word carried weight. His decision now could change everything, or send them all back to the brink of violence. Finally, Harlan spoke, his voice rough with emotion. I've spent my life upholding the law, but maybe I've been blind to the fact that the law doesn't always serve justice. He turned to Frank Donovan. If what they're saying is true, if your brother was raiding Indian camps, killing children, then Chaska acted in defense of his people. You're taking their word over mine? Donovan growled. After all these years? I'm considering all the evidence, Harlan replied coolly. Something I should have done from the beginning. He looked at Chaska. I don't know if I can ever approve of my daughter's choice, but I can acknowledge that I may have been wrong about you, and about what happened to Robert Donovan. Ruth felt tears spring to her eyes. It wasn't full acceptance, but it was a start. A crack in the wall of prejudice that had defined her father's worldview. So what now, Sheriff? Jenkins asked. The bounty on this man's head, the charges against him? Harlan straightened in his chair. As Sheriff of Barrel Creek, I'm withdrawing the charges against Chaska, pending a full investigation into the raids on the Cheyenne camps. You can't do that, Donovan shouted, leaping to his feet again. I'll go over your head. I'll take this to the territorial governor. You do that, Harlan said calmly, but I think you'll find the governor isn't keen on settlers who take the law into their own hands, raiding peaceful Indian camps. He stood up, facing Donovan squarely. And while you're at it, you might want to explain why you've been paying men to hunt down an innocent man, rather than letting the law take its course. Donovan's face twisted with rage. His hand moved to his gun, but before he could draw, Jenkins had the shotgun leveled at his chest. Don't, the trading post owner said quietly. Not in my place. For a tense moment, Donovan stood frozen, his hand on his weapon. Then, with a curse, he backed down. This isn't over, he snarled, looking from Harlan to Chaska to Ruth. Not by a long shot. He stormed out, his men following. The sound of galloping horses marked their departure. In the silence that followed, Ruth moved to her father's side. Thank you, she said softly. Harlan looked at his daughter, seeing the woman she had become, strong, principled, unafraid to stand for what she believed in. Despite everything, he felt a surge of pride. You get that from your mother, he said gruffly. She never backed down either when she thought she was right. Ruth smiled through her tears. I know. Harrison closed his notebook with a satisfied snap. I have everything I need for my story. The full truth will be published in the Fort Collins Gazette and sent to papers across the territory. People will know what really happened. Blackhawk spoke, again with Harrison translating. Words in newspapers will not protect our people if men like Donovan decide to take revenge. No, Harlan agreed, surprising everyone by addressing the Cheyenne elder directly. But the law can. If I'd known about these raids before, I would have stopped them. I give you my word as sheriff that I will investigate every claim, bring charges where appropriate, and protect all people in my jurisdiction, Indian and white alike. Blackhawk studied the sheriff's face, then nodded slowly. An understanding passed between the two men, not friendship, not yet, but a recognition of shared values despite their different worlds. What about us? Ruth asked, moving back to Chaska's side. What happens now? Harlan looked at his daughter and the man she had chosen. The sight still troubled him, but he was beginning to see beyond his initial reaction. That depends on what you want, Ruth. And you, Chaska. Chaska stood tall, his arm around Ruth's shoulders. I want to clear my name completely. I want safety for my people, and I want to build a life with your daughter if she'll have me. I will, Ruth said immediately, leaning into his embrace. Harlan sighed heavily. It won't be easy. People on both sides will object. We know, Ruth said, but nothing worth having ever comes easily. Jude joined them, forming a small circle that bridged the divide between their worlds. I think it's worth trying, he said. What's the alternative? More hatred, more death? Harlan looked at his children, both of them standing on the side of a truth he was only beginning to see. Maybe they were wiser than he'd given them credit for. Maybe the future belonged to those who could see beyond the boundaries of race and custom, who could find common ground even in the most divided places. "Come home," he said finally. "All of you, we'll figure out the rest from there." Ruth felt a surge of hope. It wasn't a perfect resolution. There were still dangers ahead, prejudices to overcome, wounds to heal. But it was a beginning, a chance, to build something new from the ashes of misunderstanding and hate. As they left the trading post together, Sheriff Wyatt, his children, Chaska, and the Cheyenne elders, Ruth touched the bone pendants at her throat. The feathers of protection and truth had guided her here, to this moment of possibility. And whatever came next, she would face it with open eyes and an open heart, hand in hand with the man who had shown her how to live honestly. The sun shone, bright overhead, casting their shadows behind them as they walked forward, together into an uncertain but hopeful future. 1 month later, the town of Barrel Creek hummed with unusual activity. Harrison's newspaper story had spread throughout the territory, bringing journalists from as far as Denver and Cheyenne to see the place where a sheriff had chosen justice over prejudice, where a white woman and a Cheyenne man had defied convention for love. The Wyatt house, once a place of rigid rules and silence, now held voices from two worlds. Ruth and Chaska had returned with Harlan and Jude, taking temporary residence in Ruth's old room while they figured out their future. It wasn't an easy arrangement. Harlan still struggled with his daughter's choice, but it was a beginning. Morning Star had come too, along with Black Hawk and several other Cheyenne elders. They stayed in tipis erected on the edge of town, a sight that had initially caused alarm among Barrel Creek's residents, but was slowly becoming less strange as days passed without incident. Ruth stood on the porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of orange and pink. The summer heat was finally breaking, giving way to cooler evenings that hinted at the approaching fall. "There you are," Chaska said, joining her on the porch. He wore a curious blend of clothing these days, buckskin leggings with a white man's shirt, his long hair still braided in the Cheyenne way, but sometimes covered with a hat when they went into town. Ruth smiled at him, taking his hand. "Just thinking." "About what?" "Everything that's happened. How much has changed in such a short time?" Indeed, the changes had been remarkable. Harrison's story, published in newspapers across the territory, had brought unexpected consequences. The territorial governor, facing pressure from Eastern reformers, had launched an investigation into the treatment of Indians in the region. Frank Donovan, implicated in the illegal raids on Cheyenne camps, had fled rather than face charges, his property seized and his influence shattered. Most surprising of all had been Harlan's transformation. The rigid sheriff still maintained law and order in Barrel Creek, but with a new perspective. He had begun holding regular meetings with the Cheyenne elders, working to establish a system where both communities could address grievances without resorting to violence. "Your father is talking with my grandmother again," Chaska said, nodding toward the barn where Harlan and Morning Star often retreated for their private conversations. Despite the language barrier, or perhaps because of it, the two strong-willed elders had developed an unlikely respect for each other. "What do you think they talk about?" Ruth wondered. Chaska shrugged. "The past. The future. Us, probably." Their future remained uncertain. They couldn't stay in the Wyatt house forever. But where would they go? The reservation was no place for a mixed couple, and many in Barrel Creek still viewed their relationship with suspicion or outright hostility. "Jude says the new settlement at Pine Creek might be a possibility," Ruth said. "It's far enough from here to give us a fresh start, but close enough to visit family." "Perhaps," Chaska said, though she could hear the reservation in his voice. Another white settlement, another place where he would always be seen as an outsider. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a rider coming fast down the road from town. It was Deputy Tom Rawlins, his face grave as he reined in before the porch. "Sheriff around?" he asked, tipping his hat to Ruth. "In the barn, I think," she replied. "Is something wrong?" "Telegraph from Fort Collins. Frank Donovan's been spotted with a group of men heading this way." Tom's gaze flicked to Chaska. "Word is, he's been drinking and talking about settling scores." Ruth felt a chill despite the warm evening. They had known this might happen eventually. Donovan was not a man to forgive or forget. "I'll get father," she said, already moving toward the barn. Within minutes, Harlan emerged with Morning Star, his expression hardening as Tom repeated the news. "How many men?" he asked. 8, maybe 10. Heavily armed. Harlan nodded grimly. "Tom, ride back to town. Get 5 or 6 men you trust, men who'll follow the law, not take sides based on personal feelings. Have them meet me at the office in an hour." As Tom rode off, Harlan turned to Ruth and Chaska. "You two should leave now tonight. Head to Pine Creek like you've been talking about." "No," Ruth said firmly. "We're not running. That's what Donovan wants, to drive us away, to make us hide." "Ruth, this isn't about pride. It's about survival. It's about standing our ground," she countered. "If we run now, we'll always be running." Morning Star spoke up, her weathered voice strong despite her age. Harrison had taught her enough English in the past month for basic communication, and she'd proven a quick study. "My grandson not afraid," she said, looking at Chaska with fierce pride. "He stay. Fight if must." Harlan looked from the old woman to his daughter to Chaska, seeing the determination in all their faces. "Fighting isn't the answer," he said wearily. "We've had enough of that." "Then what do you suggest?" Chaska asked. Harlan was silent for a moment, thinking. Then his face set in lines of decision. "We meet them before they reach town. Out in the open, where everyone can see what happens. No ambushes, no surprises." "A parley?" Ruth asked. "Of sorts, but with the law clearly visible." Harlan straightened, his hand moving unconsciously to the badge on his chest. Frank Donovan needs to understand that times are changing. What he could get away with before won't stand now. Black Hawk appeared from the direction of the Cheyenne camp, having received word of the situation. After a brief consultation with Morning Star, he spoke to Chaska in their language. "My uncle offers warriors," Chaska translated for Harlan, "to stand with us." Harlan shook his head. "No. That would only confirm what Donovan believes, that this is a war between white and Indian. It's not. It's about the law applying to everyone equally." Ruth felt a surge of pride in her father. For all his flaws, all his old prejudices, he was trying to build something better than what had come before. "Then what's the plan?" she asked. "We meet them at dawn, at the crossroads north of town. Me, my deputies, and—" He looked at Chaska. "You if you're willing, no one else." "I'll be there," Chaska said without hesitation. "Father, I'm coming too," Ruth insisted. "No, Ruth, this is too dangerous. I'm part of this. I have been from the beginning." Her voice was firm. "And Donovan needs to see that I'm with Chaska by choice, not coercion." Harlan sighed, knowing his daughter well enough to recognize when argument was futile. "Stay back then. Well back." The night passed in tense preparation. Jude insisted on joining them despite Harlan's objections, arguing that his place was with his family. Morning Star and Black Hawk reluctantly agreed to keep the other Cheyenne at their camp, understanding that their presence might provoke violence rather than prevent it. Harrison arrived from Fort Collins shortly before midnight, having received word of Donovan's movements. "I want to document whatever happens," he told them. "The whole territory is watching Barrel Creek now. What happens here could set a precedent for relations between whites and Indians throughout the West." Dawn found them gathered at the crossroads. Harlan, in the center of the road with his badge gleaming in the early light, Chaska beside him. Ruth and Jude a short distance back with Harrison. 6 deputies formed a line behind the sheriff, their faces solemn. They didn't have to wait long. As the sun cleared the eastern horizon, the sound of approaching horses reached them. Then Frank Donovan appeared, leading 8 riders armed with rifles and pistols. They drew up in a ragged line across the road, facing Harlan's smaller group. Donovan looked worse than when they'd last seen him, unshaven, red-eyed, clothes stained from hard traveling, but his voice was steady enough as he called out, "Step aside, Wyatt. This is between me and the Indian who killed my brother." "No, Frank, it's not," Harlan replied calmly. "This is about the law, and the law says Chaska is innocent of murder. Your brother died in a struggle after he raided and burned Indian camps, causing the deaths of innocent children." "Lies," Donovan spat. "All lies spread by that newspaper man and your turncoat daughter. The territorial governor doesn't think so. He's issued a warrant for your arrest, Frank. for organizing illegal raids on peaceful Indians, for attempted murder, for fleeing. Justice. Harlan took a step forward. Come in peacefully, stand trial. If you're innocent, you have nothing to fear. A harsh laugh escaped Donovan. You expect me to trust white man's justice now, when it's been corrupted by Indian lovers and Eastern do-gooders? I expect you to respect the law, Frank. The same law you claimed to uphold when you demanded justice for your brother. The law? Donovan's voice rose, cracking with emotion. Where was the law when savages were attacking settlers, when women and children were being killed on isolated homesteads? The law didn't protect us then. We had to protect ourselves. By attacking innocent Cheyenne camps. Ruth called out, unable to stay silent. By burning lodges with children inside. That's not protection, Mr. Donovan, that's murder. Donovan's gaze snapped to her, his face twisting with contempt. You, the sheriff's daughter who spreads her legs. For an Indian, you have no right to speak of right and wrong. Ruth felt Chaska tense beside her, but she squeezed his hand, keeping him from responding to the insult. I speak of truth, she said clearly. The truth your brother died trying to hide. The truth you're still running from. Donovan's hand moved to his gun. I've had enough of this. Don't, Harlan warned, his own hand hovering near his holster. Don't make this worse than it already is, Frank. You're outnumbered. Even if you start shooting, you won't leave this crossroads a free man. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. The rising sun cast long shadows across the dusty road, highlighting the stark confrontation, Donovan and his men on one side, Harlan's smaller but determined group on the other. Then one of Donovan's riders, a young man barely out of his teens, lowered his rifle. I didn't sign on for this, Mr. Donovan, he said nervously. Fighting Indians is one thing. Going against the law is another. A murmur ran through the other riders. Another lowered his weapon, then a third. Doubt spread through their ranks like a contagion, leaving Donovan increasingly isolated. Cowards, he snarled at his deserting men. All of you. No, Frank, Harlan said quietly. Just men who can see which way the wind is blowing. Times are changing. The days when you could raid and kill with impunity are ending. Not while I'm breathing, Donovan declared, and in one fluid motion he drew his pistol and fired. The shot went wide, kicking up dust at Harlan's feet. Before he could fire again, Harlan and his deputies had drawn their weapons, and Donovan found himself staring down the barrels of 7 guns. Drop it, Frank, Harlan ordered. Last chance. Donovan's face contorted with rage and desperation. For a moment, Ruth thought he would force them to kill him. Then, with a curse, he threw his gun to the ground. Arrest him, Harlan told his deputies. Hand any of his men who want to keep fighting. The rest can go as long as they leave the territory and don't come back. As the deputies moved to take Donovan into custody, the rancher fixed his gaze on Chaska. This isn't over, Indian. It will never be over as long as your kind and mine share the same land. That's where you're wrong, Mr. Donovan, Chaska replied calmly. This land has always been shared by different tribes, different animals, different ways of life. It's men like you who can only see the world in terms of what you can take from it, who create the conflict. Donovan spat on the ground but said nothing more as the deputies led him away. His remaining men, seeing the fight was lost, turned their horses and rode off in different directions, abandoning their leader to his fate. As the dust settled, Ruth moved to stand between her father and Chaska. Is it really over? She asked, hardly daring to believe it. This part is, Harlan said, holstering his gun. Donovan will stand trial. With Harrison's evidence and the governor's backing, he'll likely spend years in prison. But the larger conflict? Chaska asked. Harlan shook his head. That won't end today or tomorrow. Maybe not in our lifetimes. But we've made a start, haven't we? Shown that there's another way forward besides endless fighting. Ruth looked at the 3 men who defined her world now. Her father, her brother, and the man she loved. Each so different, yet each trying in his own way to build a better future than the past they'd inherited. Yes, she said, taking Chaska's hand. We've made a start. They rode back to Barrel Creek together, the morning sun warm on their backs. Word of what had happened at the crossroads spread quickly through town. By midday, a crowd had gathered in front of the sheriff's office, curious to see the once powerful Frank Donovan behind bars. Harlan addressed them briefly, explaining that justice would take its course and urging everyone to return to their normal lives. Most dispersed, though some lingered, discussing in low voices what these events might mean for the future of Barrel Creek. That evening, the Wyatt house hosted an unusual gathering. Morning Star and Black Hawk sat at the kitchen table with Harlan, while Ruth, Chaska, Jude, and Harrison occupied the sitting room. The atmosphere was subdued but hopeful, like the calm after a storm. "What happens now?" Jude asked, breaking a comfortable silence. Harrison set down his coffee cup. "The territorial governor has asked me to write a full account of everything that's happened here. He believes it could serve as a model for other communities dealing with tensions between settlers and Indians." "A model," Ruth repeated, surprised. "We've hardly solved all the problems." "No," Harrison agreed, "but you've shown a different path is possible. Sheriff Wyatt choosing justice over prejudice. The Cheyenne working with the law rather than against it. That's more than most places have managed." "It's still fragile," Chaska observed. "One incident could undo everything we've built." "That's true of any peace," Harrison said. "The question is whether enough people on both sides are committed to maintaining it." From the kitchen came the low murmur of voices as Harlan and the Cheyenne elders continued their own discussion. Ruth could pick out phrases here and there, talk of boundaries, hunting rights, a regular council where grievances could be aired before they festered into violence. "You never told us what you decided," Jude said, turning to Ruth and Chaska, "about where you'll go now." The couple exchanged glances. It was a question they'd been discussing privately for days, weighing different possibilities. "We're staying," Ruth said finally. "At least for now." Jude's face lit up. "Really? Here in Barrel Creek?" Chaska nodded. "Morning Star believes our presence here is important, a living reminder that change is possible." "And Father?" Jude asked. "Is he all right with this?" "He's adjusting," Ruth said diplomatically. "He's offered us land on the west side of his property near the creek. We can build our own place there, live our own way." It was more than they'd hoped for, this grudging acceptance from Harlan. Not the wholehearted welcome Ruth might have wished, but a beginning that could grow into something stronger with time. "And the baby will have family nearby," she added softly, her hand moving to her still flat stomach. Jude's eyes widened. "Baby? You're—" "Yes," Ruth confirmed, a smile spreading across her face. "We just found out yesterday. Morning Star knew before I did somehow." "Old women always know these things," Harrison said with a chuckle. Chaska's expression was a mixture of pride and concern. "The child will be of two worlds, belonging fully to neither." "Or to both," Ruth countered. "A bridge, like us." The conversation in the kitchen had stopped. Ruth looked up to find her father standing in the doorway, having overheard their news. His face was unreadable for a moment, then softened almost imperceptibly. "A grandchild," he said, his voice rough with emotion he rarely showed. "Your mother would have been pleased." It was as close to a blessing as he could manage, but for Ruth it was enough. The gap between them, between all of them, was slowly closing, one small step at a time. 2 months later, the first snow of winter dusted Barrel Creek in a thin layer of white. On the west edge of Harlan Wyatt's property, a new structure stood. Not quite a traditional Cheyenne lodge, not quite a white man's cabin, but something in between. Chaska and Jude had built it throughout the fall, with occasional help from some of the younger men in town who had come to respect the Cheyenne warrior who had chosen peace over vengeance. Ruth stood in the doorway, wrapped in a shawl mourning Star had woven for her, watching the snow fall. Her belly had just begun to show, a small rounded curve beneath her dress that filled her with wonder and occasional anxiety. What kind of world would her child be born into? Would it be the world of divisions and hatred that she had grown up in, or the new world they were trying to build, one where different peoples could live side by side, if not always in harmony, then at least in mutual respect? Chaska joined, her slipping an arm around her waist. "What are you thinking?" he asked, a question that had become familiar between them. "About the future," she replied, "our child's future." He nodded, understanding her unspoken concerns. "It won't be easy for them." "No," she agreed, But they'll have us, and Jude, and your grandmother's wisdom, even my father in his way." The mention of Harlan brought a small smile to Chaska's lips. The sheriff had been making awkward but sincere efforts to bridge the cultural divide, spending time each week at the Cheyenne camp, learning their ways and customs, even attempting a few words in their language. "Your father is a strong man," Chaska said. "Strong enough to change when he sees he's been wrong, that's rare." "Like you," Ruth said, turning to face him. "Strong enough to choose a different path when revenge would have been easier." Chaska's hand moved to the bone pendants that still hung around Ruth's neck, the feather of protection and the feather of truth. "These guided you to me," he said softly. "When I had lost hope, you found me by the river. And when I was lost, in a world of rules that made no sense, you showed me a different way to live." Ruth leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid warmth of him against the winter chill, honestly, freely. From the direction of town came the sound of approaching horses. Ruth looked out to see her father and Jude riding toward their home, bundled against the cold. Sunday dinner had become a ritual, the family gathering each week to share a meal and news to maintain the fragile bonds they were rebuilding. Behind them rode Harrison, now a regular visitor as he documented the evolving relationship between Barrel Creek and the Cheyenne. His articles had drawn attention far beyond the territory, bringing both support and criticism from various quarters. But the important thing was that people were watching, learning, considering possibilities they had never imagined before. "We should go in," Chaska said. "The stew will be ready." Ruth nodded, but lingered a moment longer, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. The world seemed clean in winter, its harsh edges softened, its flaws hidden beneath a blanket of white. A fresh start of sorts. "Ruth," Chaska called from inside. "They're almost here." "Coming," she replied, turning away from the view. As she moved into the warmth of their home, Ruth thought about the words her mother had whispered to her long ago. "Don't ever speak your heart too loud." It had been meant as protection, a way to survive in a world that demanded conformity and silence from women. But Ruth had learned a different lesson. Sometimes the heart needed to speak loudly, to be heard above the clamor of prejudice and fear. Sometimes a single voice raised in truth could change everything. Inside, Chaska was setting the table, moving with the easy grace that had first caught her attention by the river. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a golden glow over the simple furnishings, some from her old life, some made by Chaska in the Cheyenne way, a blending of worlds, just like their child would be, just like they were becoming, together. Outside, the horses drew closer. Ruth placed a hand on her growing belly, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as they had faced everything else since that fateful day by the river, with courage, with honesty, and with the unshakable conviction that love could bridge even the widest divisions between people. She moved to the door to welcome her family, all of her family, into the home she and Chaska had built step by step, choice by choice, between blood and honor, between past and future. A home founded on truth, strengthened by love and open to all who sought a better way forward. As she opened the door, the winter light caught the bone pendants at her throat, making them gleam like promises kept, like hope made tangible in a world that needed it more than ever. "Welcome," she said, her voice clear and strong in the crisp air. "Come in from the cold." And they did, one by one, crossing the threshold into the warmth of possibility, into the future they were creating, together, word by word, day by day, heart by heart. The end.